Good evening and welcome to tonight's event, a debate on the existence of the Christian God. I'm Hugo.
And I'm Jake.
And we are both from the Bible Reloaded, a YouTube channel that is basically an atheist Bible study.
Yep. We basically just read it from a secular perspective. It's a kind of a comedy show. But we're in a more serious role today, and we are moderating. And just because we are technically on Justin's side today, doesn't mean at all that we're going to favor Justin or we're not going to favor Stephen. So we were asked to do this, and it's an honor, and it's a great privilege, and we have so many people here we did not expect. So thank you everyone for coming. Also, there are comment cards strewn about on the tables. If you guys have any questions that you want to be answered at the end of the debate, feel free to fill those out. And then we'll collect them right before we do that, which will be after the cross-examination and the final statements.
Yeah, and this obviously, as we said, a lot more people than we expected. So if there aren't enough cards out there, if you have a scrap piece of paper or anything, you can just use that, and we'll collect those along with the others later.
Yep, and we obviously we can't get to everybody, so we'll rifle through them as fast as possible, and we'll get some good questions. Then you guys can have a chance to ask your own philosophical questions to these two great guys. So now...
a couple more things, just quickly. Anyone has cell phones or anything, try and silence them if you can. And I think it goes without saying, but regardless of your own personal opinions, we're all respectful of each of the speakers. They've given their time here. So let's just be aware of that. And quickly we'll go over the format, and then we'll introduce the speakers. There's going to be an opening statement for both of them. They'll each get 20 minutes for that. Then they'll have time to rebut each other's opening statements. That'll be 10 minutes. Then there will be a cross-examination period where they'll be able to ask each other questions, a more conversational sort of thing. And then we'll get the closing statements and then the Q&A. So first...
Oh, that's you.
Let's introduce our speakers.
All right, so first we have Stephen. Stephen will be arguing for the God of Christianity and his existence. He works to connect the challenges of following Jesus, the logical reasons for believing in Jesus, and viewing all life through a biblical framework. Currently, Stephen works at the Director of Spiritual Life at Oakland Christian School in Auburn Hills, Michigan, chairs the Bible department, and teaches high school theology and apologetics. He attended Monday Moody Theological Seminary and graduated with a Master's of Theology in 2010. Since then, Stephen has authored 2 books, which are both available on the tables outside these doors. They are called Marked, Discovering What It Means to Follow Jesus, and the other one is Reasons for Christian Hope. So if you're interested, definitely let them know. And served as a general editor for a student book project, Certain Erasing Doubts of the Christian Faith. Currently, Stephen is pursuing a second master's in apologetics from Viola University and is part of the adjunct facility at Grace College. You can find his website at stephenkozak.com. That's KOZAK.com. So, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. All right. And then on the other side, we have Justin Sheaver. He will be arguing that the Christian God does not exist. Justin was raised a believing Christian until his mid-teens when he was forced to take up intellectual arms as a good Christian soldier should, against his own growing doubts. Justin lost that battle. Now Justin is a co-host of the Reasonable Doubts podcast at doubtcast.org and an active member of the Center for Inquiry Michigan. Justin enjoys promoting a friendly yet firm skepticism towards religious claims. Justin has lectured on the philosophical arguments for and against the existence of God and has participated in several debates with Christian apologists, most of which can be found online. Okay, so we're going to begin with Stephen and your opening statements.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Justin for inviting me to Secular Student Alliance. And thank you all for coming. Like they said, when I asked, I didn't know exactly how many were going to attend. This is a fantastic turnout to think about and talk about one of the most fundamental and important questions, I think, in life. Throughout history, the question of God, in any capacity, has really taken center stage in the public square. Sometimes it evokes frustration, sometimes joy, purpose, sometimes hatred. But the question remains of supreme importance. So I want to offer tonight 3 reasons, although basic, but that Christian theism is the more plausible worldview. See, the question of existence has been and continues to be one of the most fundamental questions throughout human history. How did all that we see come into existence? We see the question come to life in science, religion, and even literature. So naturally, it's with existence that I'd like to begin tonight. So I want you to imagine for a moment that a loud bang just occurred outside the doors of this room, enough to interrupt tonight's discussion. Many, if not all of us, would be asking the question, well, what was that? Where did it come from? Was the noise an explosion? Was it an object that fell? Or some other cause? Well, I believe this notion holds true for the universe as well. It's natural for us to ask, where did all this come from? How did we get here? See, everything that has an explanation, there's an explanation for everything that exists. And in this case, I want to assert that the best explanation for the existence of the universe is, in fact, God. Many in search of an explanation of the universe might simply declare that nothing has caused the universe, it just popped into existence. Almost as if the Big Bang gathered enough amounts of nothing to suddenly create something in an unprecedented cataclysmic event. However, if somehow the world started with nothing, out of nothing, we would continue to have nothing. Because naturally, out of nothing, nothing comes. See, but we're not just speaking about nothing in terms of an empty space, because even a space which appears to have nothing is still something. Nothingness is the absence of even space itself. No properties, nothing at all to measure. But clearly, we have something. It might be really cool to even have a round of beers just kind of pop into existence right here, right now, and we'd all have a party. It'd be great. But none of us would be justified in believing that to happen, no matter how long we waited. Even philosopher Russell Standard comments, it seems to be that as soon as something exists, then it calls for an explanation, whereas a state of nothingness does not require an explanation. So it's clearly not true of things in the universe, so we can assume that it's not true of the universe itself. So that leaves us with only two options left for how the universe came about. Either one, the universe has always somehow existed, always been here, or two, it began to exist through an originating and sustaining cause beyond the constraints of space and time. Well, first, could the universe be infinite? That is, it's always existed, and through a series of random mutations, intelligent human life transformed into what we know it as today? Well, this sounds reasonable enough, but it really ends up falling short of a logical explanation. For example, if in fact the universe did not begin to exist and therefore not requiring a cause for it, then an infinite number of past events would have preceded this event tonight. But the problem is that infinity is just really an idea or a potential number. It's not an actual. It's only an idea in our minds and not considered a physical number. But what happens when we try to add or subtract from infinity? Well, we're left with no more or no less than what we started with. In other words, no matter how much you add or take away, we are still left with infinity. Well, this is logically unacceptable. For if we try to capture enough finite moments in time and attempt to reach infinity, we'll never get there. So we would never have reached this event tonight. German mathematician David Hilbert noted that the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature, nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea. So this leaves us with the third option, that the universe began to exist. If the universe began to exist, then we must have an originating cause. Further, this cause must be beyond anything we can imagine. It must be eternal, spaceless, timeless, and incredibly powerful. And personal, so as to cause such a vast universe to come into existence. And I want to look at three reasons to demonstrate that this is the case. First, the cause of a finite universe must be something infinite. Something beyond space and time, some kind of prior state of affairs to the universe, some kind of uncaused causer. Second, if such a vast universe is going to be caused, then its originating cause must have a significant and sufficient amount of power to have created something without any pre-existing material. And third, this cause must be personal. Everything in the universe is considered contingently existent. That is, its existence is dependent upon some other force or being. So the universe, also contingent, must have been caused by something that is necessarily existent. That is, something or someone that exists in and of itself, or uncaused. Well, there are only two things that we know of that can fall into this category. An abstract object like numbers, or some kind of personal mind. Well, an abstract object can't create anything or cause anything to exist. So we're only left with the possibility of a personal mind who created the universe. So to summarize my first argument, premise one, everything that comes into existence has an originating cause that explains its existence. Premise two, the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has an originating cause that is eternal, all-powerful, as well as personal. Second, the moral argument. Pick up any book on the history of Nazi Germany and the concentration camps and treatment of Jewish women and children, the other various evils caused by Nazi Germany. Stories about such event and others like it often bring us to tears, leaving us seeking justice in the face of evil that defies human explanation. But what reason do we have for such a declaration? What reason do we have for demanding justice in the face of evil? How is it that we can make such a judgment regarding what is good or evil? To do so, we must declare a worldview that accounts for the origin, existence, and knowledge of this good and evil. We need a worldview that provides motivation to oppose evil and pursue good. But can we say that objective moral values exist? Well, philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell said that man had invented various devices for causing the individual's self-interest to be in harmony with the herd. Philosopher Michael Ruse said that morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction. But these views do nothing to describe why humanity cries out when children are forced to carry weapons as soldiers or little girls sold into sex slavery. According to Ruse and Russell, our moral duty would be to simply do what's best for ourselves and our community and keep peace with as many people as possible. The atheistic worldview offers nothing in the way of explaining this need for justice and the pursuit of good. Even Friedrich Nietzsche, in his emphatic declaration that God is dead, knew that with God's death came the death of objective value, meaning, and significance. He knew its implications, and he knew that life would have to be redefined and even repurposed. From the atheistic perspective, then, humans should be considered nothing more than higher functioning animals, and we should be held to the same moral standard as any other animal: survival, instinct, and reproduction. So then the idea of morality really has no meaning. Therefore, there's no murder, and there is no rape. But still, many have tried to argue the presence of relative morality. That because there are differences in opinion about all sorts of laws and ideological systems, then we are not in a position to impose one cultural value or moral over and above another. In this case, social systems are responsible for creating moral standards and really nothing more. Well, at first glance, this seems to make some sense. There are many customs and practices considered part of the social norm in one culture and considered obscene in another. But think, however, what this implies. In a piece entitled Self-Definition, Morality, former president of Planned Parenthood suggested that her career in motherhood was dedicated to passing on a legacy of tolerance to her daughter, and that, quote, men and women of America are demanding that they be allowed to mold their lives not at the arbitrary command of the church or state, but as their conscience and judgment may dictate. She goes on to say, when others try to inflict their views on me, my daughter, or anyone else, that's not morality, it's tyranny, and it's un-American. Well, this is well written and very, very persuasive, but she does assume a sort of neutral moral high ground. In doing so, she desires that we respect each other's views, but anyone who disagrees with her is un-American and tyrannous. But despite her insistence in a subjective standard, she is convincing people to adhere to an objective standard, the one that she came up with. Well, what should be obvious here is that in a world of moral relativism, achieving true neutrality finds its moral hero in the sociopath, one who lacks the conscience that the rest of us have. This is the only way one can achieve true moral neutrality, because morals really no longer matter. So then what happens when two opposing worlds collide? When the plane slammed into the World Trade Center towers, most of us, if not all of us, cried out that a severe injustice had been done. Who's right? Who's wrong? So where does God come in all of this? How then can those responsible for the deaths of over 3,000 innocent lives be held accountable if we do not maintain some sort of absolute moral standard? If we somehow choose ourselves to be the means by which we measure morality, well, then we're left with nothing to measure. For example, suppose that little Johnny had never seen a ruler, and his teacher gave him a homework assignment to go home and measure himself, but he had never seen a ruler. He doesn't know what to do, so he decides to use himself to measure himself. So he goes back to school, tells his teacher that he's 1 Johnny tall. Do we really have any information on how tall he is? Well, of course not. This doesn't make any sense. The measuring rod must be independent of the thing being measured. Otherwise, we have nothing to measure. The same can be said of morality. We cannot be ourselves the means by which we measure our own morality. We must look beyond ourselves to something greater. We need something beyond the created order, something beyond space and time, something personal that serves as the ultimate standard and judge for morality. So morality without the reality of God really becomes a larger problem for the atheist. Without God, there is no moral standard. Without a moral standard, there's no means of measuring morality. Without the means in which to measure morality, there's nothing left to measure. Therefore, morals really do not exist. Apologist and theologian Douglas Gruthis suggested that since there is no objective moral meaning or value, there is no possibility of moral reasoning. Individuals are left to create morality on the basis of anything, or in fact nothing. So to summarize my moral argument, premise 1, if a personal God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Well, objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. And lastly, the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus is the most critical of all of the evidence, because for the Christian, everything hinges on the resurrection. If Jesus is not raised from the dead, Christianity is not a viable worldview option whatsoever. New Testament scholar and historian N.T. Wright noted, the resurrection of Jesus offers itself to the student of history or science no less than the Christian or theologian, not as an odd event within the world, as it is, but the utterly characteristic, prototypical, and foundational event within the world as it has begun to be, not as an absurd event within the old world, but the symbol and starting point of a new world. It can be said with near absolute certainty, among scholars both Christians and non, that Jesus was in fact crucified under the Roman government sometime around 30 to 33 AD. While it's clear there's a wide variety of scholarship in this area, the historical person of Jesus of Nazareth traveled first century Palestine as a Jewish rabbi, and because of the perceived threat he had in the Jewish religion and the peace of the Roman Empire, he was crucified. Whether biblical scholars or historians, the investigation of the person of Jesus has resulted in almost unanimous consent. But I want to take these accepted points one step further, and I want to offer 3 simple yet key pieces of evidence that provides more than enough reason to assert that Jesus resurrected from the dead 3 days after being crucified and buried, and thereby affirming his claim to be God. Number 1, the discovery of the empty tomb. I believe that Dr. William Lane Craig correctly states that the historical credibility of the story of Jesus' burial does support an empty tomb. It would have been strictly followed custom to ensure that the body was properly prepared and placed in a tomb prior to the Sabbath, which began at sundown on Friday. Jesus' body would have been wrapped in roughly 100 pounds of linens and spices, and then placed in the tomb that was guarded by Roman soldiers. More so, this empty tomb was discovered by women. Now, to appreciate the thrust of this fact, you got to understand that the role of women in Jewish society is critical. A woman's testimony was never, at any time, considered valid. If the early disciples were trying to fabricate a story, women discovering the empty tomb would not have been the means to do that. If the tomb had not been empty, the preaching of the apostles could have, and most likely would have been stopped by simply producing a dead body. If Jesus was the threat that Rome and the Jews thought he was, it was in their best interest to produce a body and put down any unneeded political unrest. Thus, the need for the tomb to be guarded. Further, if Jesus had been killed and buried in a tomb and left there, it would have been extremely likely that the tomb would have been venerated as that of a saint. This custom would explain why the women were at the tomb in the first place, preparing the site for later tribute. Further, Jews in hopes of a future resurrection would preserve the bones of loved ones in ossuary boxes, and yet we have no such box. Number 2, the historical accounts of post-mortem appearances of Jesus. I think the most compelling witness of the resurrection of Jesus is the Apostle Paul. But I want to make sure I know that when I consider the evidence available from the biblical text, I am not taking the Bible as the inspired Word of God, only as a historical document recognized by a wide range of scholars, both Christians and non-biblical scholars as well as historians. So Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth describes the various appearances of the risen Jesus in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. Paul's authorship of the letter is undisputed among scholars, and in this passage, Paul is invoking an already existing creed of the church. The letter was drafted in the middle 50s AD and is known to be the earliest account of the resurrection. Historians have also determined that since Paul mentions Peter and James as witnesses to the resurrection, and Paul met with and received this info from them some years earlier, it is likely by most historical accounts that this creed dates as far back as the 30s AD, right on top of the event. This information is well attested among scholars from all spectrums. Even the well-known atheist New Testament critic Gerd Ludemann comments, "I do insist, however, that the discovery of pre-Pauline confessional formulations is one of the great achievements of recent New Testament scholarship." So what this shows is that the affirmation of the resurrection was established a short time after the event and added to the early community's fundamental beliefs. Further, it disproves the resurrection as a much later developed legend. Instead, the witnesses that Paul speaks of were alive and available for questioning. Therefore, it seems clear that Paul was recording what he received from the earliest eyewitness disciples closest to Jesus. And finally, the transformation of the early disciples. Historical record of the early Christians illustrates the group of people who, upon the crucifixion of Jesus, fled for fear of their own lives. That is, until they believed he resurrected and appeared to them. The attitude of the Christians after they had allegedly witnessed a divine miracle became bold proclaimers of the gospel. There is no doubt that they believed Jesus had resurrected and willingly endangered themselves and suffered at times brutal deaths. They lived, as the first century Roman historian Tacitus noted, enemies of the human race. If the resurrection did not happen, then scholars need to derive the reasons for the rapid growth of Christianity across the ancient world. How could the disciples of Jesus, who did not understand or even conceive of the idea of a resurrection of one man, who could not stand by the side of Jesus risking their own lives while Rome took his, suddenly brave persecution, declaring that Jesus had indeed risen from the dead? The earliest and most consistent message of the early church to today has been grounded in the resurrection of Jesus. So, to summarize my arguments. First, a personal, spaceless, timeless, and all-powerful mind is the best explanation for the existence of the universe, which we call God. The objective moral values that we all share illustrates the necessity for a standard beyond ourselves, a someone that serves as a giver and judge of this moral law, which we call God. And finally, Jesus of Nazareth lived a sinful life of miracles, asserting that he was in fact the same God. This claim was then verified by being resurrected from the dead, whom we call God. Therefore, I continue to assert that the belief in the Christian God is the more plausible worldview. Thank you.
Good evening. I want to thank Anthony Sutliff and the Secular Student Alliance here at Ferris State University for inviting me to participate in tonight's debate. And I'm happy to be sharing the stage with author and Christian apologist Stephen Kozak. And I want to thank all of you guys for coming, for putting down the controls to Grand Theft Auto 5, even if it takes just for a few hours, and coming to an event that I think the kinds of which don't happen nearly enough. And so I'm delighted to be here with you today. Now, while it is true that Stephen and I disagree on some of the most basic, fundamental questions that one could possibly ask themselves, I find myself in complete agreement with him when he writes in his most recent book, quote, "No matter how we wish to look at or define reality to suit our own experience and our needs, there are always consequences to getting it wrong." And I think he's absolutely right about that. See, I used to believe in everything Mr. Kozak believes. I read my Bible regularly. I felt absolutely certain that I had a profound relationship with Jesus Christ. It was hauntingly real to me. Eventually, my mind started to have doubts. I tried to resist these doubts by reading apologetic authors like Lee Strobel and C.S. Lewis, but once I began to once I began to critique those arguments, I soon began to learn that the evidence just isn't with Christianity. That was very surprising to me and also very disturbing. Tonight I hope to make it abundantly clear that a proper dose of reason urges us to abandon this ancient yet rich tradition. Now, there are several ways that one might argue against the existence of a particular God. One of those ways is to argue that this particular concept of God is logically incompatible with some feature of reality. We might call this the deductive approach. Another way is to argue that the existence of God is very improbable, given some features of the world. And we might want to call this the evidential or probabilistic approach. I'll be using both of those approaches tonight. The deductive will be first. Christianity holds that there is a God who exists causally, but not necessarily temporally, prior to the existence of the universe. It is the theologians and the philosophers among them that tell us that God is to be properly understood as a maximally great being. One rather trivial point that can stand as a commonality between Stephen and I is that we both believe that the universe exists. That's something that we have in common. The reality of the universe, of course, and the objects within it are just too obvious to deny. However, I want to argue that a Christian's belief in the existence of the universe and their belief in God stand in an uncomfortable relationship with each other. That there exists a tension between these two beliefs, once the concept of a maximally great being is taken to its logical conclusion. Because God is to be understood as a maximally great being, he must be absolutely and essentially perfect, both morally and ontologically. But what is meant by ontological perfection? Well, there are things called great-making properties. And things like power, being loving, and having knowledge. And God, if he exists, has these properties to their respective maximal degrees. The words of Christian philosopher J.P. Moreland can help shed some light on this. J.P. says, quote, "To say that God is perfect means that there is no possible world where he has his attributes to a greater degree. God is not the most loving being that happens to exist, rather he is the most loving being that could possibly exist. So that God's possessing the attribute of being loving is to a degree such that it is impossible for him to have it to a greater degree." So the question before us tonight is, if the Christian God were to exist, would he have motivating reasons to intentionally create anything? The theist only has one option here, of course. He must answer yes, because after all, the theist also accepts that the universe exists. However, I want to argue that theists should answer this question in the negative, that God, if he existed, could not have motivating reasons to create anything, let alone an entire universe and populate it in the ways that we see it to be populated with. The argument involves the term God world. And no, this is not a theme park. Rather, for our purposes here, let God world refer to that possible world where God exists alone and nothing else exists for eternity. Of course, to say that God world is a possible world just means that it's a way that reality could have been, even if it is not the way that reality actually is. So, of course, this argument takes for granted that God's creation act was indeed a free act and not born of necessity. So the argument goes as follows. Premise 1, if the Christian God exists, then God world is the unique best possible world. Premise 2, if God world is the unique best possible world, then the Christian God would maintain God world. Premise 3, God world is false because the universe does exist. Therefore, the Christian God, as so defined, does not exist. Now, this argument sure seems valid, but is it sound? Are the premises true? Premise 1, if the Christian God exists, then God world is the unique best possible world. Why I think that this premise should be true? Well, if God exists, remember, he is the best possible being, meaning that he has all those great-making properties to their maximal degrees, and no such properties to any lesser degree. Now, a world composed entirely of this single best possible being, existing alone for eternity, would be a world composed entirely of all the great-making properties to their maximal degrees, and no such properties to any lesser degree. Now, unless, of course, there is some unique source of goodness, goodness that exists outside of and fully independent of God, which I think we've just heard that Stephen would not accept, then God world must be the unique best possible world. Premise 2, If God world is the unique best possible world, then the Christian God would maintain or preserve God world. I think that this is true. Well, if God exists, and he is truly the maximally great being that the philosophical theologians hold him to be, then he would be surely aware of the fact that himself existing alone for eternity, as God world, is the best possible world that could ever exist. And because God is essentially morally perfect, he couldn't have a motivating reason to intentionally alter the overall quality of that maximally great state of affairs. Because any alteration, of course, of the overall quality would by necessity be a degradation of the overall quality. A maximally great being such as God would sustain the beautiful, eternal tone of perfection. God would not introduce limited entities, each with their own unimpressive set of degraded great-making properties, like the creation myth of Genesis holds, where we have God creating Adam and Eve. Now, of course, surely Adam and Eve have great-making properties, but they have them to a limited degree. They have knowledge, but it's limited. They have power, but it's very limited. And so this can't be seen as anything other than a degradation of the overall quality of that possible reality. Any plausible conception of what it means to be a maximally great being has us thinking that God would maintain and preserve God world, because to suggest that God is in the degrading business is to suggest that he was never maximally great in the first place. Premise 3, God world is false because the universe exists. Well, I shouldn't really have to justify that premise. And conclusion, therefore, the Christian God does not exist. Now, I do want to anticipate one possible objection to this argument before moving on. Perhaps the theist responds by saying, well, my view of God has him caring more about the actualization of the greatest number of goods of great-making properties in the world, even if such properties aren't to their maximal possible degrees. My God is that way. God isn't concerned about the purity or the quality of the overall properties that actually exist. He merely wants to multiply them, quality be damned. But this kind of divine promiscuity strikes me as extraordinarily implausible. If this objector and others like him get to use their kind of moral intuitions as guides to what kinds of properties count as great-making, then they can't consistently shy away from the fact that to sacrifice quality on the altar of quantity is something that we all intuit as an imperfection. Everybody intuits this. Theists and non-theists are in common ground in recognizing that it is far better to desire one extraordinarily high-quality relationship for the remainder of our lives than to have a maximal number of short flings of very poor quality. Manufacturing managers will tell you that there's little value in doubling production when you triple the nonconformities. Moreover, without independent justification for thinking that a maximally great being, if he existed, that he would desire quality over quantity, this response would be gratuitously ad hoc in the most transparent way. Now, for my next argument, I will be using the evidential approach. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. What is evidence? Well, Colin Helson, philosopher of science, writes, quote, "To say that a body of information is evidence in favor of a hypothesis is to say that a hypothesis receives some degree of support or confirmation from that information. So your cookie jar is unexpectedly empty, so you hypothesize that your roommate stole the cookies. Now, if later that day you observe your roommate with crumbs on his face, then this new observation would, of course, lend strong support to your hypothesis, because now your hypothesis is more probable than it would be if it were standing alone. The hypothesis with the new evidence makes it more probable than if it were standing alone. So my next argument is the problem of evil or suffering. This is an evidence-based argument against the existence of a being who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, essentially God. Now, it is my claim that the number and degree of geographic distribution of instances of suffering constitutes very strong evidence against the existence of a God as just defined. In Uganda, an organized gang of chimpanzees suddenly attacks and inflicts extreme violence on another lone chimp who has wandered into their territory. They close in with a screaming frenzy, biting, kicking, and inflicting powerful blows, causing horrific injury to the immobilized chimp, until at last nature shows a bit of sympathy and allows him to die after several minutes of pure torture. Now, thanks to University of Michigan primate behavioral ecologist John Mattini and his 10-year study of the chimp community in Uganda, we now have definitive evidence that bands of chimpanzees violently kill individuals from neighboring groups in order to expand their own territory and secure additional resources. Even isolated instances of cannibalism have been observed in these Ugandan tribes. Now, there's very little difference, of course, between us and the chimpanzees and other great apes. Chimpanzees, our closest cousins, are highly intelligent social animals and are especially sensitive to physical and emotional pain. Like humans, they exhibit a range of emotions including pleasure, deep depression, pain, empathy, and grief. Now, why would a loving God allow this kind of violence to happen to these chimps? If God is all-knowing, he must surely know about the evils and the suffering, so that can't really be an excuse, and he's all-powerful, so that can't be either. And if he's good, it sure seems like he would want to prevent these sufferings. But I do want to give the man upstairs a bit of a break here. We do have a history, so I feel obligated on that end. I'm perfectly willing to grant that God may have reasons for allowing certain evils or instances of suffering to occur in the actual world. After all, it seems plausible to me that if God exists, God may have reasons for allowing some evils to ensure some greater goods to occur. But, and this is important, a perfectly loving God would never allow an instance of evil or an instance of suffering unless it was logically necessary for bringing about some greater good. That is to say that if God exists, then every instance of suffering is permitted for a very good reason. If God exists, there are no unnecessary evils or sufferings. But of course, many of these evils and sufferings, ranging from people like Jeffrey Dahmer and his victims, and you have Ariel Castro and the 10-year horrific captivity that those young women went through. Clearly, there are some instances of suffering that seem like they have no justification. It seems like God could have prevented them without avoiding or without missing out on some greater good. And I think that fact should lead a rational person to say that probably some instances of suffering aren't just confusing or mysterious, but that at least some evils or instances of suffering are actually gratuitous. And so to the degree that they are probably gratuitous, to that degree, God probably does not exist, all else being equal. So the argument... Oh, you have it. All right. The argument goes as follows. Many evils or sufferings seem gratuitous, purposeless and unnecessary. Premise 2, probably at least one of those evils or sufferings actually is gratuitous. Premise 3, if the Christian God exists, it would not permit any gratuitous evils or sufferings. Conclusion, all else being equal, probably God does not exist. Now perhaps you're thinking, not so fast. You can't go from the mere fact that many instances of evil seem like they have no justification to the conclusion that therefore probably at least one has no justification. However, I disagree. We make these kinds of inductive inferences all the time, and we are perfectly rational in doing so. For example, suppose that after searching my entire house, I cannot seem to find a fully grown adult elephant. I don't know why I would be doing that, but let's avoid that for now. Naturally enough, I would infer that there probably isn't one there. Now, I take it that nobody in this room would find that to be an irrational inference. And so for the same reason, nobody should find my conclusion that probably at least one of these instances of suffering is actually gratuitous, especially given the number of apparently gratuitous sufferings. And so in the words of philosopher Robert Bass of UNC, quote, evil counts against the existence of God just as crabgrass on the golf green counts against the existence of an efficient greenskeeper. My third argument is not so much of an argument against the existence of God, rather it is an argument in anticipation of a popular response to the evidential problem of evil that I just presented. Essentially, I want to force my opponent to either accept that the vast number of seemingly gratuitous suffering does indeed constitute very strong evidence against the existence of God, or to accept the position of being unable to know that the central claims of Christianity are actually true. So most of the time, theists will object to the inference that I made between premise 1 and 2 of the evidential problem of evil, mainly from that there are many apparently gratuitous evils, to probably there's at least one of those that is actually gratuitous. They will usually say something like, well, if God existed, he would be so far above us and know so much more than us that the mere fact that we can't see any justification for God allowing the vast number of particularly harsh instances of suffering to occur doesn't give us any reason to think that probably at least one lacks justification. After all, the script would go, seemingly unjustified suffering is only evidence against God if we should expect to be able to understand God's reasons for allowing the things that he does. And no sensible Christian would make such a claim. For all we know, God has reasons for allowing things that we simply don't understand. Now, a number of theistic philosophers have advanced this response to arguments similar to mine. So people like Alvin Plantinga, Stephen Wybstra, and William Lane Craig. Now, if this statement is true, then I must agree that it does seem to avoid the central inference in the evidential problem of evil, because it says that all things considered, we're simply in no position to place probabilities on whether or not God has a justification for allowing particular evils. However, if this is the kind of epistemic humility one should expect given the existence of the Christian God, then a significant problem enters the picture. Speaking of the implications of this view, philosopher Eric Wielenberg writes, quote, "We seem to be in the dark when it comes to determining the likelihood of the existence of some spectacularly grand good that is connected with divine lying in such a way as to justify it," unquote. And so, okay, here we are. Premise 1, if the Christian God exists, then he has exhaustive knowledge of all moral goods, evils, and entailment relationships between them. Premise 2, we limited human beings have no good reason for thinking that our knowledge of the goods, evils, and entailment relationships between them is even slightly representative of the relationships of the goods, evils, and relationships between them that actually exist. Premise 3, if 1 and 2, then we are in no position to place probabilities on whether there is a beyond our understanding justification for God's lying to us in asserting D being some biblical assertion. And conclusion, if we are in no position to place probabilities on whether there is a beyond our understanding justification for God's lying to us in asserting D, then we do not know any proposition that has biblical justification only. This argument shows that while Christians can surely be invited to believe in the truth value of propositions that have biblical justification only, they cannot know these propositions are true because they lack rational justification or warrant. Every biblical divine assertion concerning the necessary and sufficient conditions for one to be saved, and every assertion regarding the salvific significance of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ falls under those statements that have biblical justification only. Now, if Christians are not in a place to place probabilities on whether or not God has morally sufficient reasons for beyond their understanding to lie to them, then Christians are in no position to place probabilities on the actual truth claims of these biblical claims, or the truth value of these biblical claims. If that's true, then Christians cannot know that the essentials of Christianity are actually true, or cannot know that they're probably true or even probably false. They have to be completely agnostic as to these issues. The actual truth of what C.S. Lewis deems mere Christianity must be completely unknowable to the Christian thinker. While not necessarily being a problem for justified belief in a God, it is certainly a big problem for justified belief in the Christian view of God, which entails things like the salvific significance of the death and resurrection of Jesus and the nature of Jesus and the relationship between him and God. So let's review my arguments. I don't have the time. Thank you.